Hello everyone. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at making a speed typing game, which is a ton of fun to make and also incredibly educational since it teaches you concepts such as DOM manipulation, API calls, timers, and so much more. So let's get started now. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to my channel for more videos just like this one. Now, as you can see on the right here, I have the finished product. We have a timer counting up. We have an area where we can enter the text in that we're typing. It'll tell us whether we're right, whether we're wrong, and if we type the entire thing correctly, it's going to move on to the next question for us. So to get started with this, the very first thing we need to do is create an index.html file where we can put all the HTML, and if we just type exclamation point and hit enter, it's going to generate all the boilerplate for us. And in here, we can just give it a title of speed typing. And then since we're going to need CSS and we're going to need JavaScript, we're going to need a link tag for our CSS. And we're just going to create a style sheet called styles.css. And then also a script tag here. And we're going to call this script.js. And we need to make sure we defer this so that it loads after the body of our HTML. I have a video on this defer keyword. I'll leave in the cards and the description below, so check that out if you're confused on that topic. But that's all that out of the way. Now we can actually move on to the HTML, and inside this HTML we need to put our timer that you can see here, the HTML for our container, our input, as well as our quote text right here. So the very first thing we want to do is that timer, and we can just create a div with the class of timer, and we're also going to give it an ID of timer so we can access it easily in our JavaScript. And for now, we'll just put in the text of 0 so that we actually can see what's going on. Next, we're going to need a container div. And inside of this container div is everything in this yellow section you can see here. So first, we're going to have a div, and this is going to be for our quote display. And we're also going to want to give that an ID, which is again going to be quote display. And that's just so we can access that in the JavaScript. And for now, let's just give it the text of quote so we can actually see what's going on. Next, we need a text area, which is going to be this content inside of here. And we want this here. We don't really need to worry about a name. We want to have this say quote input as our ID. We don't need columns or rows. And then we can put a class, which is going to be quote input. And we'll just put a hyphen in there so it's CSS-like. And for now, we'll put the content of quote inside of here just so we have something to play with. And now with all that out of the way, that's all the HTML that we're going to need. Actually, one last thing is let's make this autofocus. That just means as soon as we load our page, our cursor is automatically going to focus inside that box, which will make starting the typing incredibly easy. Now we can open this with Live Server by right-clicking and clicking Open with Live Server, which is an extension for Visual Studio Code I have downloaded. So if you don't see that, make sure you download that extension. And as you can see, we have our timer, our quote, as well as our input, where we can type whatever we want inside of it. Obviously, it looks nothing like this, but we can get started on making it look like that by adding in our styles.css, where we're going to put all of the styles for our entire application. The very first thing I like to do is to make my box sizing to be border box. So we can come in here, change our box sizing to border box. This makes working with widths, paddings, margins, borders so much easier. And the next thing I want to do is work on styling our body, because as you can see over here, we have our stuff in the center. So we want to make sure our container is centered inside of our body. So we can change this to be display of flex. We can justify the content in the center, and we can align the items in the center. And then if we put a min height of 100 view height, that's going to center our content, as you can see. And then to make it so that our scroll bar does not exist, we can just remove the margin by setting the margin to 0. And that's going to get rid of the scroll bar for us. Now, to make the background look the same as the background over here, we can just put on a background color, and I just have this copied over. This is a purpley background color, and if we save that, you now see we have that purple looking background color. Also, our font is going to be slightly different over here, so what I want to do is I want to select our body as well as the quote input. So we have quote input, and I want to change the font family for this. And we're just going to use something like this Gill Sans here. And if we save, you can see now we have a slightly more interesting font to look at. It's nothing amazing, but at least it's something a little bit different. Now, next I'm going to work on our container. And this container is this yellow color that you see here. We want to make sure that we center this inside of our screen, make that yellow color and do all that fun stuff. So I'm just going to copy over that color. So we can go background color, and this is going to be a yellowy color. And if we save that, you can see that yellow color is showing up. But obviously everything is really scrunched up. So we're going to add a padding of 1 rem that pushes everything away from each other. Looks a lot better already. We'll also add a slight border radius. We'll just use 0.5 rem just to give it rounded corners. I think it looks a little bit better in my opinion. Also, we're going to set a default width of 700 pixels. And obviously this is kind of large. So we're also going to set a max width. And this max width is just going to be 90% of the screen size. That way it never expands too far past the edge of our screen. And the last thing we want to do is actually work on making our timer so it doesn't show up right next to it here. We want our timer to show up in the top section. So we can just select our timer, and what we want to do is position it absolutely. So we can say position absolute, and we'll just say top of 3 rem, for example. And as you can see, that's pushing our timer all the way up to the very top of our page. Let's actually make that 2 rem so it's a little bit closer to the top. And we're going to make the font size huge. We'll say 3 rem. And we'll also change the color to be exactly the same as our background color for our container. And now if I save, you can see we have this really large timer at the top. And to make it stand out a little bit more, let's just make that font weight a bold. Okay, that looks really good right there. Obviously, it's not counting up. We need the JavaScript to do that. But for now, that looks really great. Now the next thing that we should probably work on is this quote display right here. All we want to do is just space it out a little bit. So we'll say quote display. And all we want to do is add a margin on the bottom. We'll just do 1 rem. And let's just make sure I spell quote properly. There we go. That just gives us a little bit of space between our input and our actual text here that we should be typing. It looks a little bit more pleasing. And now we can move on to styling the input, which is going to be the most complex styling for this entire application. The first thing I want to do is I want to remove the background color here. So we're just going to set that to transparent. And I want to set the border to be 2 pixels solid, and it's just going to be a slightly darker version of the background color that we have here. I just copied this over. So if we save, you can see that it's just a slightly darker color of this yellow. That way it doesn't stand out too much. It kind of just blends in with the background, which is really what I want. Also, as you notice, when we select it, we get this really annoying blue outline. So I'm just going to disable the outline by setting it to none. But if you do this, it's impossible to tell that this is clicked on. There's no focus state. So what we need to do also is make sure we select our quote input, and we want to select for the focus state. And here we're going to put a border color, which is just going to be black. That way when we click on it, you can see that turns black. So that way we know we're focused inside of that element. It really just makes it easier for people to know where the focus is. And if you ever disable outline, you really need to make sure that you highlight this focus state to make sure that it actually is working how you want it to. Next, we want to work on sizing this. So one thing we want to do is obviously make it take up 100% of the width. That way it's going to fill the entire container. And we're also going to give it a height. We'll just say 8 rem. That way it's really large. That way if we have any large text, it'll easily fit inside of this box. Also, we're going to set the margin to auto. That's just going to make sure that this always stays centered. And if we set resize to none, you'll notice right now I can resize this box. But if we set resize to none, it's going to prevent me from resizing that. So let's refresh, and you can see that drag box is no longer here. So I can no longer resize our input, which is great. Next, let's make it so that our text isn't quite so pushed up against the edge. We can do that with a little bit of padding. We'll just say 0.5 rem and 1 rem. And as you can see, that already looks a lot better. It makes our text a little bit more inside the center. Also, you notice that our text up here is not in line with our text down here. So we should probably fix that. And the easiest way to do that is to set some negative margins. So we can say margin left, and we want to calculate this. It's going to be our left padding, which is -1 rem. So we just want the opposite of this. And we also want to subtract out our border. So -2 pixels. And now if we save that and we do the exact same thing for our margin right, but of course, instead of negative, we want these to be positive. So we want 1 rem plus 2 pixels, and here 1 rem plus 2 pixels. You can now see that this text has exactly lined up with the text inside of our input, and it just makes it easier for when we're typing to know exactly where everything's going to be. You'll also notice that the font size here is slightly smaller in our input, so we can just change our font size to be 1 rem, And that is exactly the same font size as out here. And now everything lines up one-to-one, which makes it easier for the person typing to see exactly where they are inside of this quote. The last thing that we have left to do is to just set a border radius. So we can say border radius 0.5 rem. That gives us these nice rounded corners, and I think that just looks a lot better. And that's the entirety of our CSS that we're going to need to worry about. And we can finally move on to the most fun part, in my opinion, which is going to be the JavaScript. So let's create that script.js, which we already linked up here inside of our index. And inside of here is where we can take care of all of our JavaScript fun. The very first thing we need to do is figure out how we're going to get our quotes into our text box here. And there's a free API that we can use called api.quotable.io, and you can go to /random. And every time we access this URL, we're going to get a random quote inside of this content attribute. So for example, here's a quote. If we do it again, we're going to get a different quote. So we can just use that API. So let's copy that, and we'll create a constant variable to store that URL. So we'll say random quote API URL is going to be equal to that quote API. And you'll be able to get this from the GitHub repo linked in the description if you want. Now that we have that done, what we need to do is actually get our API quote. So we can just create a function, which we can just call get random quote. And inside of this function, what we want to do is we want to use the fetch API. If you're unfamiliar with this fetch API, I have an entire video covering fetch API. So just make sure you check that out, linked in the cards and the description down below. But essentially, we just need to put in the URL for our API, which is this URL. And then we want to call the .then property because this returns a promise. And inside of here, we're going to get a response object. And to convert that to JSON, we just need to say response.json. This also returns a promise. So we need a separate then inside of here. And this is our data. So this data attribute is essentially what we see right here. And we want to get this content key. So we can just say data.content. And we just want to make sure we return this. And we're going to do this in an asynchronous function in order to actually handle this. So we can just say, for example, function get next quote, just like this. And we're going to make sure this is an async function. And then inside of here, we can call get random quote. And if we just put the await keyword in front of here, we can actually get our quote, for example, like this. And then we can just log out that quote. So we can say console.log of quote. And now if we call that function, which is get next quote, and we can come over to our game, we inspect this element, and we go to the console, you can see that the quote is being printed out. And if we were to refresh this, you can see we get a different quote being printed out. And every single time we go to the page and refresh, we're getting a brand new quote being generated every single time. So that's how our get random quote function is working. And if you're unfamiliar with this promise syntax or the await syntax, I have videos both on promises and async await in the cards and description that you can check out. Now the next thing we need to do is actually change this function. We're going to call this render new quote because we're actually going to render our quote inside this function. And we're going to make sure we call this right at the beginning like this. And now what we want to do is get our elements. We have our quote display where we're going to show our quote and our quote input where we're going to type our quote. So let's actually go into our JavaScript. And we want to get a constant variable, which we're just going to call quote display element. And we're going to set that to document.getElement by ID. And that is just quote display like that. And this is going to be our quote display element. And we can actually just come in here, say that our inner text is going to be equal to that quote. And now every time we refresh, you can see that our quote is being put inside of here. And it's always going to be a different quote, which is great. Now, also what we need to do is make sure we clear out this input. So we want to get our quote input element, and this over here is just quote input like that. And what we want to do is just clear that. So we can say quote input element dot value is going to be equal to null. And as you can see, that clears out the value inside of this input every single time that we get a new quote, which is exactly what we want. Now, one thing is that we can't actually just put the inner text of our quote display element to the quote, because as you remember over here, we changed the color of each individual letter based on whether or not the letter was correct or incorrect. So in order to do that, we actually need an individual element for each character of our quote. So to do that, we actually need to go through a loop. So we can say quote.split, and we can say what we want to split on. And if we pass in an empty string, it's going to convert our string to an array where each individual character is one element in that array. So we can then loop over that array by saying for each character. Then we can do something for each one of these different characters. And we want to create a new element. We're going to call this our character span, and it's going to be document.createElement, and we're going to create a span. And then we can take that span and we can set the inner text to be equal to that character. So essentially what we're doing here is we're getting each individual character in our string, creating a span for it, and then setting the text of that span to that individual character. And then what we can do is we can take our quote display element and we can just append a child of that character span. And if we come in here and just make sure that we clear out our inner HTML by setting it to a blank string every time, now what we can do, and also this needs to be inner text of character like that. We actually need to set to the character text. I talked about it, but never actually did it. Now if we save that, of course, everything's not working. And this because inner text is obviously not a function. I need to set the inner text like this instead of calling a function. And now as you can see, everything is working over here. But if I actually inspect this element, you'll notice that we have a bunch of different spans. As you can see, each span is one individual letter, which is going to make it so we can apply individual colors to each one of our letters as needed, which is perfect. We can actually test that by just coming in here and saying that we want our character span.classList.add, and we're just going to add a class of correct. This is going to be what our element looks like if we have the correct letter, that green color. So inside of our style sheet, we can just come in here and say that we want to set the color to green. And as you can see, everything is green if it has a class of correct. If we want to test for incorrect, that's going to be the incorrect class. And inside of here, obviously, we can just get incorrect. And what we want to do is we want to set the color to be red, as you can see here. And we're also going to set the text decoration to underline. That way it really sticks out if they type something in incorrectly. With this giant red underlined word, it's really easy to see. Obviously, we don't want these classes to be set right away, so we're going to remove that, and it's going to start off with just the black text. But as we type characters down here, we're going to want to do things by checking to see if these characters are correct. So to do that, we need to set up an event listener. So we can say, quote, input element dot add event listener, and we want to add on the event listener input. And essentially, this input element or event listener gets called every single time something inside of here changes. And we can actually see that by just saying console.log changed. And if we inspect our page, move this way off to the side, and I start typing in here, you can see every single time I type something or remove something, it's logging out this changed text. So let's remove that and obviously implement what we need to do. But before that, we should think about exactly what this function is going to do. Essentially, we want to loop over all of the different characters in this array here, all of our different spans, and we want to compare each individual character to the individual character in this input based on their position. So the first character here compared to the first character here. If they're the same, we add the correct class, and if they're different, we add the incorrect class. And if, for example, here we only have 5 characters, so this character here, this 0 or this O, we don't want to apply anything to it because we haven't actually typed that far yet. We just want to leave that completely plain and black. So to do that, all we need to do is first get all of our different spans. So to do that, we know that they're inside of our quote display element, and we can do a query selector all for spans. This is going to get every span that is inside of our quote display element, essentially every single one of these characters. And we can just set that here to a variable, which we're just going to call array of quote. That way we know that this is our actual quote. And then we want to do a very similar thing. We're going to get another array. This one is going to be for our value, and it's going to come from our input element. And we want to get the value of that, and we just want to split that on an empty string. Again, same thing. We're going to convert our string to an array of each individual character. And now all we need to do is loop through our array quote. So we can say array quote dot for each, and we want to do this for each character inside of this, and we want to make sure we have access to the index. And this is actually going to be a span, so we'll call it character span, so we know that this is our span. And the second parameter here is just the index. So the first character is going to be 0, second is 1, third is going to be 2, and so on. So with that index, we can actually get the character from our value by saying array of value, and we want to get the index. Essentially, the first character here is going to be the first character inside of this quote. second one's going to be the second one of the quote, and so on. It allows us to match up the characters. Then we can just do a check. We can say if character is equal to character span dot inner text. So if they are exactly the same, what we want to do is take our character span, we want to get the class list, and we want to add in the correct class. But we also need to make sure that we remove the incorrect class so that it never shows up as incorrect and correct at the same time. Obviously, that's not possible. Otherwise, what we want to do is the exact opposite. For example, if they're not equal to each other, we want to remove the correct class and add the incorrect class. Now, if I start typing, you can see when I type the D, this shows up green, but all of this other stuff is showing up red. And this is because we're not checking to see if their character is null. So we need to have another check here, which is character equals null. And what this means is we haven't typed that character yet. And if we haven't typed the character yet, we want to remove the incorrect class and remove the correct class because we haven't gotten there yet. And then we can change this to an else if. So essentially what we're saying is if we have not typed this character, then just make it black, remove all of our classes. If we have typed it and it's the same as our other character, then we want to add the correct class. And if we have typed it and it's not the same, we want to add the incorrect class. Now if I save that and I start typing, you can see that is working. But if I type something incorrect, like a D here, you can see it's going to underline that. And everything else I type incorrectly is going to be underlined in red, and all of the correct stuff is going to be highlighted in green. But if I get to the point where I type everything out correctly, I want to move on to the next quote because obviously it doesn't make sense to keep typing after I got it all correct. So what we need to do is actually check here. We can create a variable. We're going to call this correct, and we're going to set it to true. So by default, we're assuming that everything is correct. So every time something is incorrect, we want to change this variable to false. So here we're going to set the variable to false because we don't have a correct element. We haven't typed that far yet. And down here, we're going to set correct to false because obviously we typed the wrong character. And then all the way at the bottom, if we do have everything correct, so if this variable is true, we just want to render the next quote. So we'll say render new quote. Now, if I start typing, nothing is going to happen, even if I finish this all the way out. But if I type this all the way, so let me copy this, and if I type this last period, you can see it clears everything out, grabs us a new quote, and now we can start typing this. And if I type all of that, it gives me a new quote, and so on. All we have left to do is to hook up our timer. So in order to hook the timer up, it's actually going to be really simple. We can just come down here and create a function we'll just call start timer. And the first thing we need to do is obviously get our timer element. So if you remember, we created an element with the ID of timer. So we can just select that like this. And as you remember in here, we have that ID of timer on our timer. And now instead of start timer, what we need to do is we first want to set the timer to 0. So we can say timer element.innerText is going to be equal to 0. We just want it to start at 0. And as you can see, that's working. And even if we remove the default of 0 inside of here, let's actually remove all of these default values. We no longer need them. You can see, of course, it's not showing up as 0. And that's because we're not actually calling start timer. So let's just make sure we call that start timer function in our render new quote. Every time we render a new quote, we want to restart our timer. Now if we save that, you can see our timer is being set to 0, which is exactly what we want. Now inside of this timer, what we need to do is just every single second, we want to update our timer. And we can use set interval for this because this takes a function and then it also takes a second parameter, which is how often you want to run that function in milliseconds. So every 1000 milliseconds or 1 second, we're going to run this function. But this has a slight problem because set interval is not exact. It's not going to run exactly every 1 second. It might run every 1.01 seconds or 1.1 seconds. It's not 100% accurate. So in order to get around the fact that it's not accurate, we need to use a start date, and we compare our start date to our current date to get the actual time that's elapsed, because we can't depend on this by just adding 1 each time. So let's come in here and we're going to get a variable called start time. And this is just going to be the date when we start our timer. So inside of here, we can set our start time to be equal to a new date. And this just gives us the current time, the current date. And now inside of our set interval, what we want to do is just want to call a function called getTimerTime. just like that. And we'll create that function down here, get timer time. Inside of here, all we want to do is we want to take a new date. This is going to be the current time. And we want to subtract this from our start time. And this is going to be in milliseconds. So we want to actually convert this to seconds. So to do that, we just divide by 1000. And now this is going to give us the time in seconds, but it might be a decimal. It might be 1.111112 seconds. So in order to make it so that it's always an integer, we can just say math.floor. And this is always going to round down. So if it's 1.1111, it's just going to be 1. If it's 1.9, it'll be 1. It'll just always round down, which is exactly what we want. And we just want to return that, obviously. And now all we need to do is set the text of our timer. So we can say timer.innerText is equal to that time we just got. And now you should see that this starts counting up, and every single second it's going to tick up one more. And the reason that we know that it's accurate is because it's based on this start time and this current date, which is always accurate to the millisecond, while set interval is not accurate. We can't depend on it. So now let's assume I'm typing along. I get all of this typed out, and all I have left to do is say it and period. You can see it gives us a new quote, it clears out our input, and it restarts our timer. So everything is working perfectly. And that's all there is to creating this speed typing game in JavaScript. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my other project-based videos linked over here, and subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this one. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.